It begins on an ordinary Friday, the kind of morning that forgives you for being human. Coffee in paper cups, a stale donut someone insists is still good, elevator doors that take one extra beat to close because the day doesn't know it's supposed to be important yet. And inside the mountain, the air is the same temperature it always is, untired, unseasoned, like the inside of a refrigerator that holds only instruments. Concrete swallows footsteps. Fluorescent lights flatten color until every face adopts the same pale resolve. Behind blast doors as heavy as stubborn gods, the nerve center is awake and modest. Rows of consoles, displays that prefer numbers to drama, and people whose professions are measured in quiet verbs: monitor, confirm, report. And on the big board, the Earth unwinds in polar projection, the northern cap a white wound stitched with latitude lines. Across that map, thin vectors wait to be assigned meaning. Operators check the routine, the hums, the handshakes, the time signals that click through networks like heartbeat echoes. Nothing unusual. A watch officer signs the log with block letters that have learned not to hurry. He settles into the chair that doesn't quite forgive his back. He drinks coffee that tastes faintly of pennies and plastic lid. Somewhere far above the planet, satellites look sideways at the world's edge, waiting for heat that shouldn't be there. Somewhere far across the continent, radars breathe their slow fans across sky and cloud and the occasional migratory disorder of geese that don't care about doctrine. Somewhere far beyond any of it, in places with snow-choked perimeters and alert doors painted the color of warnings, bomber crews linger near aircraft that smell like fuel and nerve. If the world has a pulse, it passes through all of them before it gets here. NTHE Watch Floor does what it is paid to do. It waits for the thing that should never come. NTHE thing arrives in the most boring way, a routine handoff. A technician does what technicians do: routes a feed, mounts a tape, presses keys whose paint has been polished by prior fingers. He is not a villain. He is not even the subject of the story he's about to write with his hands. He is a custodian of repetition. On a rack in a nearby lab, there's a reel, a training scenario, a simulation of a bad day, built so instructors can teach people how to fight a war that must be fought only in rehearsal. The reel is not marked with malice. It is marked like everything else, by a label you would step over without seeing, by a number that makes sense to a system. And then, as quietly as a thought that chooses the wrong door, the simulation moves from the world where it belongs to the world where it doesn't. A training stream finds an operational artery. A ghost of war, meant to live, fenced inside a classroom, escapes and puts on a uniform. NTHE Watch Officer hears it first as a change in the room's weather. A printer that begins to chatter as if it has developed a stutter. A tone that isn't a siren, not yet, but wants to be. A murmur from a console, where murmurs usually die before they make it to ears. Heads tilt the way grass tilts before a wind you can't yet feel. On the screen, the numbers start behaving like verbs. Detection. Tracks. Multiple. Across the upper United States. Icons bloom so fast, a human could convince himself the screen is lagging. But the screen is not lagging. The screen is telling a story it has been told to tell. The story is this: an opening salvo large enough to empty an inventory. Not one, not five, too many to comfort. The kind of count that makes a procedure stand up in a chair and shout "Nuck, confirm." The watch officer's voice is a tool he uses the way a surgeon uses a clamp. He wants the word to pinch the moment shut, to stop anything from spilling. Cross-check. Someone else says it with the same breath. The room becomes the sound of verbs in the correct order. And up at the National Military Command Center, phones wake people who wanted to spend this morning counting paperwork instead of minutes. Across the country at bomber bases, crews lean toward telephones like sprinters toward blocks. Air defense squadrons feel their necks get light and their stomachs get heavy. An FAA liaison lifts a receiver that will pour worry into air traffic control rooms that were, seconds ago, thinking about weather and lunch. NBUT here, inside the mountain, it is still an equation, and equations require both sides to show up. The training tape, which the room does not yet know is a training tape, has told one side of the story. The other side belongs to physics. If the launches are real, radars must find the skin of what was born. If the launches are real, satellites must show the heat. The map is shouting without fat. The instruments must agree. The ladder has rungs, space, Earth, human, no skipping allowed. NTHE, watch officer, leans forward so slowly, it looks like he is deciding to be a different person. He isn't. He is deciding to remain the same person in a different second. Space-based? He asks. A voice that has been trained to sound like a straight line answers. Negative indications at this time. The satellite feed, unimpressed by what the board is pretending, stays calm. Ground-based? He asks. No, confirm. Comes back, the words careful as man in a mine. On the front row, one operator reaches for a pen, misses the barrel once, and then finds it. Her hand trembles for a beat and then obeys. She writes the time down because the act of writing is how you tell a moment how to behave. NTHE, big board, does not stop. The tracks continue to arrive as if an invisible stenographer is taking dictation. To the right, the alert banner blinks with a rhythm that feels like pulse. On a different wall, a status board begins to change color, the kind of change an eye picks up even if the mind refuses to be recruited. Across a nation, in rooms like this room but smaller, steps in the ladder begin to move as if they have done this before in a dream. Hold escalation, the watch officer says. 3 syllables that are less a command than a fence. Verify sources. A checklist is already halfway open. It doesn't need to be. Everyone here has been drilled to place it in their heads where fear cannot reach it. NHE does what the book wants and what the book fears. He calls the place that calls the bombers. He calls the place that calls the air defense birds. He calls the representatives whose job is to bring the voices of other agencies into this womb of concrete. We have indications, he says, plain as arithmetic. We do not have corroboration. He asks for caution in a dialect that only professionals appreciate. Stand by, hold posture, await confirming sensors. The words feel like chewing gravel. They taste like responsibility. A lieutenant whose future includes long gray hair and a habit of watching windows lifts eyes from a console that loves green and hates red and says, "Sir, the plot density." And the watch officer cuts in with, "I see it," because he does. He sees it the way a captain sees waves that want to be mountains. He knows the board is screaming in the language of the scenario it was fed. He knows reality will take a minute to answer, because reality has to curve around an Earth that refuses to hurry. And across the secures, the lines populate with voices that want the one thing voices always want. A sentence that lets them act without becoming the subject of a congressional hearing. They get instead the sentence the law prefers: we are assessing. Assessment is not indecision. Assessment is the verb that buys the world a minute. The phones don't like it, but the phones do not write history. People do. NTHE minutes that follow stretch, but not like taffy. They stretch like ligaments, alive, tense, ready to tear if abused. The clock hand jumps in legal increments. The human heart tries to invent smaller seconds it can count in between. In air traffic control centers, controllers do math they hoped never to do. If this is the morning, what do you tell pilots? You tell them nothing. You keep them separated by altitude and heading, and you do not recruit civilians into existential sentences unless you have to. Non-runways, crews finish their fast ritual, Steps drilled until they can be done with gloves that make fingers stupid. A bomber smells like metal and fuel and old intentions. A fighter smells like speed. The men who put those smells into air wait for a word that would turn them into history. They do not know that a tape is pretending to be war. Back in the mountains, someone makes the mistake of trying to comfort by saying it's probably a glitch. The watch officer doesn't reprimand. He doesn't nod. He lets the sentence die of its own lack of oxygen. Glitch is a word for television sets and misbehaving calculators. Glitch is what people say when they don't want to do the work of diagnosis. Here, in this room, you do the work. You keep your verbs clean. Any infrared confirmation? Negative. Any radar skin tracks? Negative. Any third-party corroboration? Negative. The negatives pile up like sandbags. The floor still feels like it's tilting toward the board. NHE asks for the training schedule because he is compulsive in the way that saves people. What live exercises were booked? What sims were in the pipeline? What tapes were loaded for academies, labs, test tracks? The answers come in fractal fragments. Nothing on the watch floor. Nothing on the primary analysis path. But the network is bigger than this floor. The network has branches that have branches. Somewhere, a door you could mistake for a closet leads to a room with a rack, and on that rack a reel is spinning like it owns the morning. In the movie version, a single phone call finds the mistake. In life, it is messier and slower and honest. Messages climb a ladder of supervisors who don't want to be the one who panicked or the one who slept. A colonel realizes he knows a guy who knows a guy in the test shop. A tech in that shop remembers the tiny, unremarkable clunk when a tape engaged. He remembers because he always remembers the way machines sound when they first wake. He has the mechanic's religion. "Sir," a voice over the intercom says, "we may have a training scenario in the path." May, have, scenario, path. 4 words you could put on a mug and never sell. 4 words that tilt the whole room back toward level. Isolate, the watch officer answers. Physically isolate, not because he doesn't trust software, although he doesn't, but because in the end, when the world tries to pretend to end, the only sentence that matters is this: pull the plug. Someone in a lab obeys with a movement as small as taking a breath. The reel coasts. The feed goes ash-gray. On the big board, the fantasy loses oxygen. Icons stubbornly linger like afterimages. Then they vanish, embarrassed to have been believed. On the lines to the command centers that make expensive decisions, the watch officer says the hardest honest thing: stand down from precautionary posture. We had a false input. He uses words that don't turn into headlines. He apologizes without saying the word sorry. He promises an assessment without promising a scapegoat. Nat airbases, hands relax without appearing to. Straps get rechecked because that is how you make your hands stop trembling. You give them work. A maintenance chief makes a joke you could not put on television and gets 2 laughs and a silence that means the laughter did its job. An FAA coordinator puts down a pen and realizes he has carved a small, angry crescent into his palm with the clip. He wipes the crescent on a napkin he will later throw away like evidence. And back on the floor, no one celebrates. Celebrating inside averted catastrophe feels like taking a bow at a funeral. Instead, they do an inventory of the morning's nouns. Timestamps, console states, routing tables that should never have kissed the live network, names of teams, names of people. In a corner, a junior tech is learning how to sit forward without seeming eager and how to be silent with dignity. She is also learning why you must label wires like you are labeling a fuse in a house where the walls listen. NTHE watch officer writes a sentence in the log that will later be read by people who were not here and will think they understand. He writes it as if it were a haiku with a badge. False indications originating from training media inadvertently introduced into operational display path. No corroboration from IR or radar sensors. Precautionary actions initiated, then rescinded on confirmation of false input. Investigation initiated. It reads like it has no pulse. It saves lives precisely because of that. NHE calls the place that answers to the place that answers to Congress and says, in the tone of a person reporting rainfall, that the sky did not fall. He does not mention his heart, which behaved, or his palms, which learned. He does not mention the minute the room's oxygen felt like it had edges. He does not mention the quiet heroism performed by an anonymous hand, switching a tape from one path to another path. An error, yes, but an error constrained by doctrine, caught by the faith in the second and third sensors, stopped by the refusal to turn one input into a launch command. For an hour, the room behaves like a wound being cleaned. Questions, answers, the antiseptic sting of finding out exactly where you bled. In the test shop, a tech writes a note to himself in a dense handwriting that looks like machine code. Never trust a label that doesn't smell like fear. He will refine that later into a recommendation that fits on a slide. Here, it's still poetry. NBY lunch, the mountain has reclaimed its calm. The vending machines apologize for being out of the good candy in the way vending machines know how. Someone swears the coffee tastes better now that the world didn't end. The watch officer pretends not to hear because tempting fate is not a policy violation, but it should be. News of the not quite a thing circulates in a sanitized form, the way institutions perfume embarrassment. A bulletin mentions a false alarm due to a malfunction. The word malfunction travels because it's comfortable. It blames an object. Very few people outside will ever hear the phrase training tape. Fewer will understand how insultingly small the physical act was. Mount a reel, route a signal, watch the world almost put on a different suit. Late in the day, the first draft of the after-action report opens like a mouth that intends to speak in clauses. The questions are honorable, if predictable. How did a training input find a live display? What interlocks failed? What interlocks were never installed because the budget was smaller than the fear? How fast did we move? How slow did we choose to be when slow mattered? Who had their hand on which phone and what did they say? Did we accidentally teach the system to believe itself too quickly? Did we accidentally teach people to trust the board more than their own insistence on the second rung? How long did the scenario run? How far did the ripples reach into the bomber force, the interceptor wings, the civilian sky? What did we learn that we can keep? Answers will take days. Policies will take weeks. The memory will take years to find its shape. There will be other mornings and other nights where wires trip over themselves and summaries try to play God. There will be, astonishingly soon, another incident, different building, different cause, where a chip, the price of soda, drags a system down a path and someone else refuses to let a number choose a verb. It will look to the public like the same story told twice with different props. Inside, it will be recognized as the same lesson still trying to be learned. You must build a world where hurry cannot make law. NFOR now, the watch floor resets its ritual. The board returns to calm geography. The status blocks regain their indifferent green. People who carry the habit of understatement into their marriages go home and do not mention the hour their hands learn to be still. They pick up groceries, they listen to a song on the radio that will be forgotten. They make the noises parents make when they try not to let their children smell the day on their clothes. They sleep poorly and say it's the coffee. The next morning, the watch officer comes in early, not because he has to, but because rooms like this reward superstition when it looks like discipline. He walks the floor the way a farmer walks a fence line after a storm, looking for weak posts, for wire that is sagged, for small cuts that become big if ignored. He talks with the technician who made the error. The conversation is professional and kind. You're not the villain, he says, but you are the lesson. The tech nods and nods again. He will keep nodding for weeks. Then he will stop. Then he will start again anytime a machine makes a sound that does not match its memory. Bot N classes begin. Short ones at first. Locker room chalk talks with schematics that look like treasure maps. Then longer ones with more chairs, with charts that show how to keep hungry inputs out of dinner service. A junior officer who thinks in diagrams draws a box in the path and labels it with 3 plain words: "Do not trust." The box will later be renamed with something official and forgettable. The habit will remain. When in doubt, do not trust a single stream. When in more doubt, unplug it and start over. NTHE watch officer writes the sentence he wishes he could staple to the front of every console. He writes it on a piece of paper that will end up folded, unfolded, softened, smudged, and finally copied into other hands in other rooms. The sentence is simple. Never let a rehearsal into the main stage without a human at the door. There is one more conversation in that first day's aftertaste that deserves to be told. In a quiet office 2 levels up, a civilian in a cheap suit and a uniformed officer with a spine borrowed from a ruler sit with a pad between them. The civilian says, "We were lucky." The officer says, "We were trained." Both are right. The officer adds, "We were also stubborn." The civilian, who has spent his career turning stubbornness into procurement language, writes, "Introduce physical interlocks between training and live paths. Require dual source confirmation before any national level notification leaves the floor. Install idiot lights that insult machines when they deserve it." He smiles at his own joke, then crosses out idiot and writes interstitial. He is the type who edits his jokes into policy. The country has room for that type. NBY late afternoon. The mountain's hum returns to the register it wears on good days. The watch officer signs another line, checks a panel, refuses a fresh coffee the way a superstitious sailor refuses to rename a boat. He stands for a moment in the doorway on his way out, just long enough to watch the faces he trusts pretend not to notice him watching. He thanks, not for the first time and not for the last, that the world is held up by rooms where nothing is supposed to happen, and by people who are proud when it doesn't. And outside, the sky is exactly the wrong kind of beautiful for the end of the world. High, empty, innocent. It always is. Cars move in orderly streams, violating physics only in the ways it is willing to forgive. On a kitchen table somewhere, a child is discovering that pencils erase as well as write, and that both are magic. In a lab, a tape sits on a bench with a new tag hanging from it. Training. Do not connect to operational network. The tag is bright enough to blind. It will eventually fade to the same yellow as everything else. The habit it represents will need to be repainted, in language and in hardware, over and over and over. The phone rings once that evening in the watch officer's living room. A voice he trusts says, "We're running the trace now. We'll have the tree by Monday." "Good," he says. He wants to ask for sleep as if it were a deliverable. He does not. He thanks the voice and hangs up and stands for a moment in the dark, because sometimes the only way to honor a day that almost became more than a day is to let it pass through you without commentary. NHE sleeps. He does not dream of tape. He dreams of a map he drew as a child, with rivers that forgot where they were supposed to go and cities drawn as stars. And he wakes with the memory of drawing a line and wanting it to stay a line. And in the morning, he will go back underground and be bored on purpose. He will praise boredom, teach it, insist on it, build hardware around it. He will revere the antithesis of spectacle, because spectacle can be engineered by accident. He will repeat to new ears, and to ears that need reminding, that warnings are not the same as war, that scenarios are not the same as strikes, that display logic is not the same as physics. He will say these things until they are unremarkable. He will hope to live long enough to become a cliché. He will succeed. NFOR. Now, the country is fine in exactly the way a country is fine when nothing happened but something almost did. The next chapters will contain investigations and memoranda, a few bruised egos, a few repaired wires, new guards posted at doors that used to be painted the camouflage color of trust. Those chapters will also contain human sentences that hold. We waited. We asked again. We made the ladder earn our weight. We did not let a tape write the day. And the mountain will keep its promise. The quiet one, it made the day it swallowed the first set of blast doors. to give human beings a room where time can be measured in the units required to be right. NTHAT is the story of the morning a training tape tricked alarms into thinking Armageddon had called ahead. That is the story of the people who refused to pick up the phone until physics, not theater, spoke. And that is where we pause, with the world intact and the lesson newly inked, before we open the file and follow the wires back to the bench that taught an entire system how easily make-believe can jump a fence. And that is where we pause, with the world intact and the lesson newly inked, before we open the file and follow the wires back to the bench that taught an entire system how easily make-believe can jump a fence. And that is where we pause, with the world intact and the lesson newly inked, before we open the file and follow the wires back to the bench that taught an entire system how easily make-believe can jump a fence. Let's open it. The trace begins with a door that doesn't brag. White paint, scuffed at ankle height by years of carts. A magnetic badge reader too old to beep cheerfully. Inside, a lab that smells like warm dust and patient metal. Racks of gear blink their small, indifferent eyes. On a workbench, a real weights, opaque brown wound on a plastic hub, a handwritten label that announces nothing but catalog numbers and the bureaucratic poetry of versioning. If danger wears a theater costume up on the watch floor, it wears coveralls here. NTWO engineers, one with the sighing shoulders of a lifer, one with the unstoppable curiosity of new, begin their archaeology. They start with the obvious: catalog entries, checkouts, the ritual of handwriting that says who touched what and when. Then they walk the cables. It is not glamorous. Fingers trace behind racks, past zip ties and dust fluffs, until fingertips come back gray. They murmur the names of connectors the way botanists murmur plant species in a field, not to impress, but to make reality stick. They find the first hinge point where innocence met opportunity, a switching shelf, the kind that can route a signal to a test harness or to the operational feed. The shelf has labels, of course. Every shelf has labels, but labels fade, adhesive peels, and a label can lie if it was told to by a hurried hand on a tired morning. A toggle sits at a neutral angle that is supposed to be safe in the diagram, ambiguous in the human eye. Yesterday, a routine task passed through that ambiguity and made it law for a few minutes. NWHY. Did the tape exist? Because people need practice. Because the worst day must be rehearsed until it becomes as boring as mopping a floor. The scenario in this reel is a masterclass in nightmare. Multiple launches, staggered timings, trajectories that hit the checklists like drum hits. In the classroom, it is a valuable teacher. In the live feed, it is a hypnotist that whispers "do something now" into a room built to do something now. NTHE investigation does what investigations should do. It refuses to be satisfied with a single villain. It collects small failures the way the sea collects glass, then polishes them until they gleam with lesson. Someone relied on color coding instead of interlocks. Someone believed a software flag would hold forever against fatigue. Someone wrote a policy that assumed doors never get propped open by wedges of habit. No one woke up wanting to risk the world. Everyone contributed a breath to the draft that almost became a storm. Nup the Chain, the first weekly meeting after the non-event, is almost impolite in its calm. No table pounding. No hunt for a throat to throttle. Just the slow work of turning a scare into sentences that will outlive the scare. The watch officer speaks first, because he is the one who will have to live with whatever they write. He speaks without poetry, because poetry makes people mistake relief for rigor. He uses the verbs that brought them through: confirm, isolate, verify, stand down. Then he adds the verb that must be invited back every time a system grows too confident: doubt, not a slide that would look humble in any other room. The latter appears again: space, earth, human, now with bolder strokes between rungs. A new box is drawn, deliberately ugly so the eye cannot ignore it. Training gate. The gate sits between any test generator and any screen a real person might act on. Inside the gate, new taboos are written. You cannot patch around this. You cannot override it with software alone. You cannot trust a label without touching the thing it claims to describe. You cannot introduce pretend into live without a human hand in the loop. Visible, accountable, unbusy. The policy people bring out their sharpening stones. Words that were once polite become command tones, where practical becomes unless physically impossible, and physically impossible must be signed in ink the color of responsibility. Interlocks migrate from budget footnotes to boldface. A phrase that was once considered rude, idiot-proof, gets translated into language that sounds civilized but bites just as hard. Fail-safe against human error, NSI simultaneously, the technicians go shopping, not for parts, but for certainty. They buy diodes that only allow current to move one way, then install them like traffic cops at every junction where a training stream could ever dream of turning into the main road. They add hardware keys, old-fashioned metal, the kind that lives on a hook and squeaks when you turn it, so that no amount of software toggling can tell a testing rig to impersonate reality without someone turning something that makes a click you can feel in your bones. They route training lines physically separate from operational lines, so that a spill in one bucket cannot flood another room. The architecture learns modesty, distance where distance is wisdom, friction where friction is safety. NBUT wiring is only half the job. The other half is people. People need rituals that honor boredom. People need habits that make glamour look suspicious. So the trainings change. Instructors put a new slide early in the deck, a picture of a reel beside a picture of a runway, captioned with a sentence that could be carved on stone. If this touches that without a human in the doorway, it is not a mistake. It is a crime. They say it without heat, because heat burns fast and leaves ash. They say it with a tired patience that students recognize as love. NS story ripples beyond the mountain. In offices where maps stay rolled like scrolls, senior officials get the sanitized brief, a false alarm with no real-world consequences. The people who live in those briefs are smart enough to read the negative space. No real-world consequences means there could have been. The calls that morning reached far enough to heat metal and tighten throats. The next time, someone's hand might be a gram lighter on a lever. That is the slope everyone in this chain is trying to sand flat. NSO, the updates flow outward. Air bases, interceptor squadrons, the quiet brains that manage commercial air. A new sentence enters the playbook for liaison calls during ambiguous minutes. We are holding, do not alter civilian traffic without explicit coordination. No one likes adding words to a script already too long for emergencies. They add them anyway, then rehearse the additions until muscle memory stops fighting the extra syllables. Meanwhile, down in the lab, the human story continues in small, unimportant-seeming motions that matter. The tech who routed the tape that morning does not lose his badge, because punishment is not the point. He loses something else that he will never get back. The belief that the world forgives certain kinds of hurry. He becomes the strictest person in a room full of strict people. He invents a superstition about touching every connector and saying quietly to himself, "Prove it." He will one day teach that superstition to someone young who will roll their eyes and then, years later, do it without thinking and feel the same private gratitude. The watch officer spends 2 days word fencing with auditors who have the correct job, which is to be annoying. He shows them the log and the stamps and the timings and the sentence where he told whole agencies to wait for physics. He does not reach for hero words. He lets the clock be his testimony. He leaves the meeting without a reprimand. He buys coffee that tastes like plastic coins and sits alone for a minute in a room nobody uses. And he does something rare in this business. He allows himself a nanosecond of pride that doesn't curdle into arrogance. Then he gets up and forgets the pride on purpose. And a week later, the tale has matured into a parable so efficiently told that it risks becoming boring. That, ironically, is the goal. The walkway outside the lab gets a small sign, functional and charmless. Training media, isolated. A different sign appears beside a switch that used to be ambiguous and now bites. Live path. Key required. The keys are kept on a board that lists names by hook. People check them out and check them back in like sacred tools. The hooks clack softly when metal arrives home. The sound becomes a kind of grace. Because institutions are fractal, the same conversation happens in miniature in rooms far from the mountain. A civil defense office in a city that will never be named in a movie. A telephone exchange that handles the private nerves of the state. A test lab that usually only thinks about weather maps and the occasional sports broadcast. Each room looks at its own version of the training vs live problem and hardens a seam. A catastrophe avoided in one building teaches 1,000 other buildings how to avoid copycat ghosts. And the world, busy, indifferent, keeps throwing new headaches onto desks. A week, a month, a year later, other alarms will bark. Some will be honest and short. Some will be dishonest and convincing. The act of resisting hurry will need to be reinvented each time, as if the verb forgets how to conjugate itself the moment a printer begins to chatter. There is a story that circulates quietly, almost like gossip, because people need to humanize luck when they suspect it wasn't only luck. The story: a senior official was roused from sleep that morning and told a number big enough to set teeth on edge. He reached for the phone that would multiply that number into missiles, leaving runways and silos and decks. Then he asked the question the system pays people to ask: do we have second source confirmation? When told no, he said a word that reins in horses. That word bought minutes. Those minutes bought a normal afternoon. Whether that exact call unfolded exactly that way matters less than what the story teaches the people who repeat it in hallways. There is always time to ask once more, and if there isn't, you make it. Back to the tape. It is retired, not destroyed, because evidence should be kept, but retired like a tool that bit its owner. It goes into a drawer with a tag that will outlive fashions in fonts. The tag explains what it did and why it must never be allowed to do it again. The drawer is not a jail. It is a museum exhibit, open by appointment, for future officers who need to touch the weight of almost. From this grows a museum of sentences. In the training school, a classroom wall gathers phrases born from scares. Never let a rehearsal decide. 2 censors before you shout. Physics before phones. The board is our friend until it's our actor. If you cannot prove it, you cannot wake the world with it. Students copy them, the way cadets have always copied mottos they think are cheesy until the day those mottos save their skin. Somewhere in the same building, a programmer rewrites a patch. He adds a heartbeat to simulator outputs that live feeds will never have, a watermark only a machine can see. He writes it with a comment in the code that future him will read when he forgets why the line exists, because a morning almost got away. Elsewhere in the system, another kind of patch is applied. Liaison protocols grant 1 more ounce of discretion to the human positioned between a display and a mass notification. That ounce does not exist to empower ego. It exists to shelter doubt. It says, in policy language that pretends not to be human, that a person may hold the blast doors of escalation for the time it takes to call a 2nd floor and ask, "Do you see it too?" That sentence will irritate exactly the kind of people who fear responsibility dressed as humility. It will also make it easier to keep aircraft where they belong until reality proves it means business. In the following months, whispers about the scare leak out to the ecosystem of insiders who trade war stories like currency. Because the event ended without flames, because no one's photo appeared above a black ribbon, because the word false sits near the top of the memo, the wider world shrugs. That is fine. That is healthy. The whole purpose of the mountain is to ensure that most people can live their entire lives without having to care about rack labels and the ethics of toggles. NBUT inside the rooms that do care, a new humility takes root. It is pragmatic, not sentimental. It says, our enemy is not only far away and bristling. Our enemy is also a wire that thinks it is a river, a file that thinks it is a weather front, a scenario that thinks it is the news. Our strategy must not only outfly jets and outthink adversaries, it must outlast our own cleverness. And time passes. Technology molting is as relentless as seasons. Reels become cartridges. Cartridges become servers. Servers become clouds with fenced pastures and guards named by acronyms. The lesson doesn't age. Training still needs to play with live sometimes, because practicing on toy maps teaches bad habits. The gate remains, a real hand on a real lock, a real voice saying, "Show me both sources." That gate gets redesigned and re-implemented in new generations of gear, but its soul doesn't change. The soul is human reluctance installed as a feature, not a bug. Now, the ending we promised, not a flourish, because flourishes spill, but a close that fits. NTHE watch officer retires years later, not famous, not forgotten, simply used up in the honorable way. At his small ceremony, the speech is short. It mentions a morning when the system behaved as designed under adverse conditions, which is public service, for we nearly learned too much about ourselves, and somebody insisted on the second rung. He shakes hands that have signed things he never saw and never wanted to. He takes a plaque that will hang crooked in a room that smells like books. He goes home and stops waking at the board's imaginary tone after a few months. He plants something in soil and discovers, to his surprise, that watching a thing grow is not boring to a man who built a life around boredom. The tech from the lab becomes the kind of safety zealot who kills jokes at parties. He also becomes the reason 3 near misses in the next decade never climb out of infancy. He writes the dull memo that later earns an ordinary award. He keeps the award in a drawer because it is too shiny for his taste. He keeps the tag from the infamous reel folded in his wallet until the day it disintegrates like a leaf. He throws the bits away without ceremony because the ceremony already happened. The day a hand pulled a plug. In the academy, new officers sit through a lecture that could have been written in another century because it asks them to recognize themselves as the speed bump on a highway designed for speed. They do not like that image at first. Then they hear the story, told calmly, about a training tape that put on a wolf costume and a room that refused to panic. They leave with a sentence that will live in their mouths during their first watch. "Show me the second source." NTHE Mountain, which never wrote its own name in lights, continues to breathe that antiseptic air and vibrate at that frequency that feels like a giant cat asleep. It processes Tuesday afternoons that never become headlines. It produces Fridays that end with the correct leftovers in refrigerators. Its blast doors, scraped at the ankles by 1,000 carts, keep opening to admit people who love boredom and closing behind them with the soft thunder that reassures without bragging. NAs for the tape. It continues to teach, even in silence. It teaches that threats wear 2 faces, the one across the ocean and the one in your own shop that looks like convenience dressed as competence. It teaches that the loudest warning can be a soft mechanical clunk if that clunk occurs in the wrong place. It teaches that heroism can look like a person staring at a screen and refusing to move their hand. It teaches that policy is not paperwork. Policy is a plank you nail down so the next person doesn't step through. What changed? Not the whole world. Not that day. But pieces shifted. Training walked on a shorter leash. Interlocks graduated from suggestions to hardware. Liaison calls got 1 extra sentence that saves 100 nervous breaths a year. Software learned to sign its name on every packet it sends so receivers can say, "I know who you are. You're not allowed in." Consoles learn to insult their own impressions by asking for company. And in the heads of people who matter at 3 o'clock, a reflex strengthened. You get to ask once more, even when the board is screaming. NSO, we end not with sirens or medals, not even with declassification. We end with a desk, a pencil, a log, and a human sitting between a number and a lever. We end with the same sentence that saved that morning and will save others. Never let a rehearsal decide. We end with the mountain doing what mountains do, holding the line between weather and weather report, between a simulated sky and the sky outside. NTHE World continued to walk its orbit like a tightrope. And beneath that wire, in rooms without windows, people kept their balance with pencils. The training tape sits, tagged and harmless, behind its new gate. The phone that could multiply a mistake into history sleeps in its cradle. And the lesson, inked, re-inked, installed, rehearsed, lived, waits for the next time a machine tries to improvise. When it does, someone will ask for the second source, and that question, quiet and stubborn, will keep the day ordinary. Nay's phone had fade on the hum that pretended to be a siren, the click that chose to be a lock, and the voice that said, "Hold, confirm, now act."